Hey, sorry. Okay, so we're just gonna.
Can you hear me? Oh, now you can. We're gonna get started. Thanks for your patience. So we're here, transparency tools for immigration justice activists, working with whistleblowers and using FOIA. So my name is Dana Gold. I'm an attorney and the director of education with the Government Accountability Project. With us, here, let me just go to this next slide. Here we go. Also with us, let me just thank first Jesse Francois on the end there with Open the Government, a policy analyst. OTG co-organized this with GAP, and just they've been phenomenal partners in helping us really bring education to the world about the power of information and this intersection of whistleblowing and FOIA. So I just want to thank Jesse for his partnership with this. And then Zach Coughlin is one of our investigators at the Government Accountability Project. And then Michael Morrissey, we are so happy to have you here. He's the co-founder and chief executive of Muckrock. So we'll hear about that later. So thanks all for coming. Let me just frame, I guess, why we're here a little bit. So, you know, Richard, my wonderful intern, he'll meet in a second, and I've been talking a lot about kind of how we've been thinking, or I've been certainly thinking about, you know, information and the power as a tool to make the gears of democracy work when they seem to be so gummed up right now, right? So we see the formal institutions of democracy with Supreme Court kind of in a problematic partisan state. We see obviously Congress being completely dysfunctional, and then we have, of course, the executive branch. You know, and I think what we've seen is the power of information to actually still affect change through information getting to the press and catalyzing public outcry and outrage and demanding attention and reaction from their representatives, from the administration. I think the greatest example of that we've seen most recently, actually there are two great examples. I think there's, you know, we'll talk about this in a second. Kevin Chmielewski and other senior EPA officials who basically disclosed serious abuses of Scott Pruitt. At the same time, we saw the Sierra Club and other organizations too, but doing great FOIA work and sharing that information about serious abuses with the press, and that creating, you know, 13 hearings and ultimately Pruitt's resignation. I mean, that was really about the power of information, and a great example of the dovetail between whistleblowing and FOIA to affect change and kind of still create mechanisms for accountability. I think another great example for that is that, you know, the audio tapes that were released of the kids in detention that were given to the lawyer, Jennifer Harbury, who then gave them to ProPublica, and it just changed the game in terms of just generating incredible mass civil society resistance, demands to Congress to do something, and the rollback of the separation policy. Obviously, we're still, you know, in a deep, you know, hellhole immigration policy, but that was actually this kind of sense that information is power, and when you utilize it, you can actually make democracy work. So it's in a very unhopeful, scary time. I feel like this is kind of all we got. And so when you have whistleblowers who are the best line of defense, inside employees who are the best witnesses on the ground to see wrongdoing, and they can turn that information into power by getting it to the press, by getting it to activists, you know, and civil society to kind of create pressure, it's kind of, again, all we got. It's super powerful. So that's what we're here to talk about today. That is the context of the kind of power of information and these different tools that hopefully, you know, will give you a little bit of depth to fuel your work. So, so that's why we're here. And I thought what we do is just go around. For those of you who were here last time, we're going to do it again. But I want to know who's here, what organization you're with, if you're willing to share, and to the extent that you have, like what your degree of experience is working with employee sources. So employees who you've either worked with, in a friendly capacity, people have called you, information you've gotten, et cetera, and also your degree of experience working with FOIA. So if we move around the room and kind of hear that, that'd be great. So, and this is Christy, our guest, our great host at Open Gov Hub. So let me,
So yeah, my name is Christy Arbogast. I work here at Open Gov Hub, and I have not worked with employee sources, nor have I ever filed a FOIA request. I want to change that.
Hi, I'm Anna Munoz. I'm an intern with ACLU actually. So it's my first internship, so I really have no experience with any of that stuff, but I'm excited to learn.
Hi, I'm Cedra St. Rain. I'm working with Access Now. I do not have employee experience, but I have done a lot of filing of FOIA requests and responses, and will be creating one in the next month.
Hey, thanks for doing this. My name is Daniela Bergi-Palomino. I'm with the Latin America Working Group, and we focus on U.S. policy towards Latin America. And same, I don't have experience with employee sources or FOIA. I've seen a lot of FOIA results, but not done one myself.
Hi, I'm Lily Fulkerts, and I'm also with the Latin America Working Group, and just ditto what Daniela said.
I'm Valerie Kirka with Counterpart International. I'm on the business development team there. I don't have experience through that position working with employee sources, but in a previous position, I ran into a situation where I did employee source recently.
My name is Ness Perry. I'm an investigative intern at the Project on Government Oversight. I have taken in employee information, and I've protected sources, as well as written 3 FOIA requests in the past month.
Hi, I'm Romy Furter with the Constitution Project at the Project on Government Oversight, and I've been trained on how to write FOIA requests and also how to handle actual sources.
I'm Nicholas Trevino from the Project on Government Oversight. I haven't written a FOIA yet, but I've received training. I'm about to start, and I haven't worked with employee sources.
Hi, I'm Kate Funk. I'm one of Dana's interns, and I go to a law school. I don't have any prior experience working with employee sources or FOIA.
I'm Richard Wang. I'm an intern with Dana at the Government Accountability Project this summer. I have no experience with employee sources nor FOIA.
Hi, my name is Laura Lynch. I work at the American Immigration Lawyers Association. I'm a senior policy counsel there. We have used FOIA as a tool for many years. It's something that we've wanted to step up with under the new administration. We just have kind of lacked the resources, but we are still trying to put as many requests out there that are relevant. In terms of employee sources, we do work with some employee sources. A lot of the information we receive pertains to immigration law practice. So we receive documents and speak with people, and it's something that's new to us under the new administration. So we're really happy that you all put this together.
Hey, I'm Rachel Landry with the International Rescue Committee. I'd say no direct experience with FOIA, but over the last year and a half, frequently have wondered, can we FOIA this? Like, can we get more information if we do submit a FOIA? Should we submit the FOIA, or should we try to get somebody else to do so on our behalf? So those are definitely questions that we've considered, and I'm on the policy and advocacy team, and we regularly work with the government and always like walk that fine line with sort of like how we use that for advocacy purposes, and then as well for our communications work as well.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Sharif. I do legal work this summer with the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. I'm a law student. I haven't worked with employee whistleblowers, but we did try to get a FOIA legislation passed through the Egyptian parliament before the coup. We weren't successful, fortunately.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robbie. I work at the Government Accountability Project. And I just want to say how excited I am to be working with all these new evangelists for whistleblowers and FOIA at the end of the day. So thanks for being here.
I'm Katie Miller, also with the Government Accountability Project. I work with whistleblowers and our legal team through the communications and sort of media relations front, but no FOIA. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katie Goff. I'm also with the Government Accountability Project. No FOIA experience, but I answer the phone and I answer phone calls from employee sources looking for support and information on a daily basis.
Okay, that's super helpful, actually. So we have a range. Okay, so I'm gonna, we want this to be pretty accurate, interactive, and I guess the advantage of having a smaller group is that we should be able to do that a little bit more than maybe we had originally planned. So maybe feel free to ask some questions along the way, but we're gonna kind of focus on the whistleblowing stuff first, and then we'll move into FOIA, and then we'll break into smaller groups, or maybe we won't with the smaller group that we have, but I think we'll just see how this goes. But let's just get started with that context. Okay, so let me just tell you about GAP. We are a whistleblower. We are a legal organization, and we provide support to whistleblowers. So people who report serious wrongdoing often suffer reprisal, but we also work to address the underlying disclosures that they bring to us. So it's not just a law firm for whistleblowers. It's about the public interest impact of the information and leveraging that into reform. So we do that through advocacy campaigns that involve working with the press, working with the Hill, working with public interest organizations to, again, make sure that it's about the message of the whistleblower and not the messenger, which we'll talk about in just a second. So let's just give some context. I think this is a good cultural definition of a whistleblower, someone who exercises free speech rights to challenge abuses of power that betray the public trust. I think I'll get into misperceptions in a second, but the legal definition, which is kind of where I land a lot, partly because I'm a lawyer, it's really, and partly I think about this because the legal landscape is really kind of an employment law scheme for whistleblowers. So typically we're talking about employees, so people who are working in an institution, government or corporate, they see wrongdoing and they make a decision to disclose information either internally to managers, hotlines, ethics officers, or externally, which would be to agencies or IGs or Congress or the press. And it's information, again, so this is weird. The reason this is an amalgam legal definition is because they're like, as Kate knows, because she's working on this monster database of all of the laws throughout, there are like 100 freaking laws that protect whistleblowers. There's not one Title VII for whistleblowers. So this is kind of I would say the basic standard that many of them follow. Information they reasonably believe, which means that they don't have to have proof that the information is that there is wrongdoing or a violation, but they have to have a reasonable belief. And the information has to rise to this level: a violation of law, rule, or regulation, gross mismanagement, a gross waste of funds, an abuse of authority, or substantial and specific danger to public health or safety. Under the whistleblower, so this is the kind of standard in the Whistleblower Protection Act, which is the big law that protects non-intelligence federal employees. The Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, which was passed in 2012, added also scientific censorship that would show a violation of law, rule, or regulation, or gross mismanagement. So that happened because whistleblowers were disclosing scientific censorship, and that's a big problem. And so that's part of the law now too, and we're actually working on strengthening the federal protections as well, and you'll have an opportunity to hear about that in a second. So this is the standard, and I say this because it's not, the reason we protect whistleblowers is because they really protect the public. It's an enforcement mechanism to make sure that the law is adhered to, there's compliance, there's accountability, and they're in the best position to do it. We don't care so much about, stealing extra Post-it notes from the supply cabinet. It has to really rise to a level that anyone would think that, oh, this is a public interest problem. So this is, so the standard is that the first thing you look at is what are they blowing the whistle on? Does it rise to that level of seriousness? And just really quickly, whistleblowers, have blown the whistle on a whole bunch of things, right? And they are the most, again, I always think of whistleblowing as like this tool for accountability. Pick your issue. If you have a whistleblower, you get so much further down the field because you have this information of wrongdoing. David Graham, he was an FDA employee. He blew the whistle on Vioxx, killing thousands of people. That was pulled from the market. Colleen Rowley, she blew the whistle on 9/11 FBI intelligence failures, and her disclosures resulted in a total reorganization of the intelligence infrastructure, so it was more coordinated. Walt Tamasitis there in the corner, he blew the whistle on huge problems that could result in a nuclear criticality accident like Fukushima at the Hanford nuclear facility in Washington State. Rick Piltz blew the whistle on scientific censorship. His disclosures actually helped drive that amendment to the Whistleblower Protection Act. Ken Kendrick, he blew the whistle on incredibly disgusting conditions at the Peanut Corporation of America, resulting that where it's killed like 14 people and hundreds were sick, and it was the largest food recall in history, and his disclosures led to passage of the whistleblower provisions of the Food Safety Modernization Act, and actually the prosecutions of jail sentences of the top 3 executives at PCA. And most recently, I mean, I could have the more recent whistleblowers, but here's one. I would just mention Kevin Chmielewski from the EPA. His disclosures, along with others, were instrumental in Scott Pruitt's resignation. So again, pick your issue. You know, if you have a whistleblower, again, you can really make a big difference. So I want to talk though about immigration and kind of how whistleblowers have really helped in this world. Kathy Harris, she worked for the Customs Service. This was quite a while ago, but she disclosed that African American and Hispanic women actually too were being targeted for detention and strip searches as possible drug couriers, even though this is like the least likely group that would be carrying drugs. And I mean, just they would do body cavity searches. They would detain them for 3 days sometimes. It was unbelievable. And her disclosures resulted in a complete overhaul by the GAO and federal legislation that protects you know, people who are being searched from abuses at customs. So that was super important disclosure. And I mentioned obviously the audio tapes that we talked about just most recently, and you know, that's not the only one. I mean, the audio tapes were important. The Southwest Key whistleblower who resigned but went on Democracy Now! To talk about the no hugging policy. You know, that siblings couldn't touch each other. You know, again, this is all part of catalyzing resistance. I mean, I think also the video and the photos, the tip from the insider of the kids being moved in New York late at night to a different shelter. Again, that was insider information that really, given to the press, changed the game. So, and then yesterday, so when we organized this, we started talking about this thing in May, organizing this in May, and yesterday a few weeks ago, some doctors came to us who are DHS, Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties investigators. They're a medical doctor and a mental health doctor who were very concerned about the zero tolerance policy and the real harm that causes to children. So not just separation, but the actual detention of children, causing serious harm because of the compliance failures that they see in the detention facilities that they investigate. And they wanted to speak out about this. They wanted, so not just as people, you know, victims, but as people who have seen it firsthand. The New York Times broke the story yesterday. They wrote a letter to Congress, which we helped them write. We sent it to the Whistleblower Caucus, and the New York Times covered the story. And now we're trying to get press, and now that we'll move into a stakeholder strategy, which I hope many of you will be interested in supporting as we move forward. So these are doctors, you know, who are again insiders that give them this unique degree of moral authority and credibility, and they are exercising their rights to speak. But it was tricky to navigate, and I will reference this as I kind of go through this analysis of kind of the things that come up as you're supporting whistleblowers and working with employee sources who want to speak out, but do so at great risk, professional risk. So most employees stay silent. We're seeing obviously so much of that in the federal administration, and they do that out of fear of reprisal, which we have seen in a very heavy-handed way in this administration. Again, even if they have rights to speak, that doesn't, you can enforce them, but that's usually after you've suffered retaliation, right? So doesn't mean that if you have a right, you're not going to still have to seek justice. So fear of reprisal is the biggest reason actually people don't speak. Actually, there's some mixed data on this. Some people say fear of reprisal is the biggest reason, and that's actually the most recent study that I read. But there's also fear of futility, which is essentially cynicism that if I say something, it's not going to make a difference. And that's why, in some ways, it is so important when the power of information is transformative. Supporting whistleblowers and acting on their information and being grateful for their choice to speak up is so important. And for them to see, if I speak up, change is going to happen, and I'm going to get protected, it'll encourage more to speak up. That's always what happens. So it is really about getting the kind of a degree of both gratitude and leveraging that information, so they are realizing that speaking up does make a difference. So we have the power actually to encourage more disclosures by how we respond to the information and to the whistleblowers themselves. And I say that because I feel like I'm on this, personal and professional mission to transform how we think our cultural understanding of whistleblowers, because that word has a lot of baggage to it, right? It's not necessarily this. Not everybody thinks whistleblower hero, whistleblower, moral courage. Sometimes they think about all of these synonyms that are found in Merriam-Webster, which almost all of which are negative. These are synonyms, not antonyms. These are synonyms of whistleblower, and notifier and maybe informant are semi-neutral, but they are all kind of have some baggage attached to them in terms of having some pejorative tone. So that's a first barrier to entry, when someone's thinking about raising a concern, or if they're going to get support for raising a concern. And like the Me Too movement, I mean, it should be that we believe the person who is speaking up about the wrongdoing and not being suspicious about their motives. And this is in part why. I just want to go through some quick misperceptions of whistleblowers. A lot of people think that whistleblowers are folks who go outside the organization. They ultimately do often when their efforts to blow the whistle internally are exhausted and fail. Or when they absolutely know reprisal is going to happen, and usually because it has started to happen. So 97% of employees report internally first. And that is a super important fact when you are thinking about how you deal with employee sources, because, for instance, promises to keep the information confidential or their identity anonymous can be very difficult to actually make good on, because if they have reported internally first to even just a coworker, hey, do you see this problem, or here's a manager, it means their fingerprints are all over that information. Even the fact that they have that information by nature of their job or their expertise means that again, promises of confidentiality or anonymity can be difficult. So this is really important to know. The fact that they're coming to you means they probably, you're not the first person they usually come to or raise this about. So that's important. Most whistleblowers are not doing this to get rich. That is a myth. They are doing it because they cannot look at themselves in the mirror if they don't say something. There are some legal provisions only around fraud that allow whistleblowers to receive a substantial sum of recovery if they report wrongdoing and the government gets money disgorged from the company that they're blowing the whistle on. All of those other whistleblowers that I identified in that earlier slide, food, environment, nuclear safety, intelligence failures, none of them have bounty provisions. They are lucky if they get make-whole remedies at the end of the day. So no one's getting rich off of whistleblowing. You'd be better off buying a lottery ticket. So that's a common, they are doing it out of a sense of professional, ethical, or legal duty. They are just motivated usually, I mean, not all. I mean, there are exceptions, but the exceptions dominate our narrative, and it's a myth. And it's a deliberate myth by those who have something to lose by having abuses exposed. And then here, this is the biggest thing that drives me up the wall, that the narrative of whistleblowing has been completely eclipsed by intelligence whistleblowers. Disclosing classified information is indeed a crime. And so we think about Edward Snowden, we think about Reality Winner. They are disclosing important information. Unfortunately, the laws that exist to represent intelligence whistleblowers are horrible. They are horrible. And so they are in this problematic situation where to report a wrong that is, a devastating degree of wrongdoing, they have to commit a crime. And that is a choice that they have made. But because we think about intelligence whistleblowers dominating what we think of as a whistleblower, it creates this narrative that whistleblowing is a crime, whereas it's right. It's a right. It is a right. It's a complicated right, but most people are not dealing with intelligence information. The doctors that we're working with, for instance, who are investigating family detention centers, that is not classified information. So that, the environmental stuff, that is not classified information. There can be gag orders, there are all these other chilling effects besides the fear and confusion that is fomented by this narrative that whistleblowing is a crime. The government has, everybody has to attend anti-leak classes. Like, what even is that? Most people are not, again, dealing with classified information, but boy, is that sending a message, don't speak, right? That is deliberately chilling. The word ban, the gag orders that were coming down, all illegal. The posters, every leak makes us weak. These are all illegal gag orders that we have gotten this Office of Special Counsel to say this is not okay. You have rights and you cannot gag employees. But the damage is done because it creates this. Your rights are complicated, and clearly the message from the government is that if you're going to speak, we're not going to be happy about that. So the complicated piece I just want to talk about really quickly is that, as I said, there's no Title VII, like one big law for whistleblowers. It's a patchwork of protections. So there's the Whistleblower Protection Act and the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act that amended that protects federal employees, not in the intelligence agencies. And that kind of meets that different standard. There are also a bunch of employee protection provisions in different statutes. So the environmental safety and financial regulations, consumer safety, all these different statutes, Clean Air Act, a whole bunch of them. They have employee protection provisions in them that basically, if you blow the whistle on a violation of that law or something that would compromise compliance with that law, you would be protected. And that applies to contractor employees. Some of them apply to federal employees as well. So corporate employees are protected by those laws. So that's, again, when you look at what are they blowing the whistle on. I want to mention the National Defense Authorization Act, which is where the permanent whistleblower protections for federal contractors and grantees are found. So 12 million federal contractors have actually the same protections that federal whistleblowers do now, but actually they're better because they get jury trials. So this is great. So all those contractors, for instance, in the immigration world, they are covered here. So this is where their support is found, and there are certain I'll talk about there are procedural differences between all of these laws that make navigating them complicated. So I mentioned the False Claims Act, which is one example of a financial law that allows not just employees actually to report wrongdoing, fraud on the government, that you get actually up to a 30% bounty of the fraud award. Again, that's just about fraud. There are state laws that exist that can be in common law. There are state false claims acts. There's a whole regulatory scheme that can protect states, so it depends on where. So these are the things that you would have to look at if you're evaluating whether or not someone has legal protection. You have to look at the type of the wrongdoing disclosed. What do they blow the whistle on? Are they a federal employee? Are they a contractor employee? Where do they live? Are they a state employee? How and to whom was the information disclosed? Did they report internally first, or did they go straight outside? It actually depends. Like this new, the new Supreme Court ruling on Dodd-Frank, even though the legislation says internal, the legislation is baked in to encourage internal disclosures. The Supreme Court ruled that you have to go straight to the SEC first. So it totally depends. It totally depends on the law. What type of retaliation? The state laws often only protect wrongful discharge. The other laws often protect lesser forms of reprisal. When did the employee become aware of the reprisal? All the statute of limitations are different. Sometimes they're 30 days, sometimes they're 3 years. Where was the disclosure made? Again, looking at what state options you might have. And then is classified or other protected information involved, because that's going to affect whether or not your rights are. So this is like this patchwork puzzle that can be very complicated to navigate, which is why we say it's really important to talk to an attorney who knows what they're doing in this area, because it provides just dramatic protection, both in terms of communication with the information, but also navigating the complex landscape of whistleblower protection. So protection's paramount. Experienced lawyers are essential for the whistleblower. I want to note that the other benefit of working with an attorney who knows what they're doing in the whistleblower landscape is that they have attorney-client privilege, which is something you don't have to go to jail for, like a journalist might have to go to protect their source. You just get privilege. And so it's the safest way to protect an employee's source is to have them go through an attorney. In public interest organizations, you might have attorneys on staff, but if they're not reaching out to you for legal advice about their rights and risks, you might not have that legal protection. So that's just something to think about. But public interest organizations, you could be subject to subpoena for information. You'd have to go into a court battle to protect that source potentially in a way that an attorney would not. I just also want to mention this whole anonymity thing that I touched on. It's, I think there's this sense that give us your information, we'll use it, and we'll protect you. And I mentioned because of the internal disclosure truth, that's a hard thing to do. So again, being very careful about the trust that is given to you as an employee source who does not understand their risk or their rights is something that you have to be aware of if an employee is coming to you, trusting you with information. And they're coming to you because they don't see themselves as a whistleblower. They see you as an organization who is doing work in an area that they care about and they want accountability, but they don't think to call a lawyer. They go because they have information about an issue. So they're gonna go to a public interest organization or the press potentially first before they go to, like, for instance, us, who actually can help them with their information. So this isn't about come to us first. The point is, because they're going to come to you first, understand the risks involved and what is important. So you are doing them the best service the minute you can say, this is complicated, you have risks, I'm going to work with you and I'm going to refer you to an attorney who can make sure that you understand your rights, risks, and options and can make sure that your information is protected. It's something to think about, I would just say, because it also telegraphs respect for their choice to come forward and share the information. It's a way of engendering trust, and it's a way of actually getting more information out of them and having more people come to you. So it's really win-win, because the last thing you want is a reputation as someone who burned a source, because it's going to dry up the information. So anonymity, though, is not always the best or safest route. You have to take on a great degree of potential risk as a whistleblower, but the way we postured, for instance, the doctors who came to us, being public about exercising their rights, that we are going to write a letter to Congress, we are exercising our rights to communicate concerns, there's a substantial a gross mismanagement and substantial and specific risk of harm. We are going to Congress, which is an entity stated in the law that I can communicate with about these serious problems, and we're going to send it to the whistleblower caucus, the people who know to protect whistleblowers, and the Judiciary Committee, who has a responsibility to investigate, and then we get the Times to report on them. It creates a bubble around them where now if reprisal happens, which could have been much more likely to happen if they weren't so public, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with these doctors, because the smart move is don't touch them. Don't touch them, because it's just going to be more of a story and it's going to bring that much more attention to the message and the problem. So theoretically, now we have this groundswell of being able to organize stakeholder support, congressional support, get investigations, and it becomes again about their disclosure and not about them, and it insulates them. And that's because they're choosing not to do it anonymously. I think that's super important. And I mentioned some of the benefits and risks of working with journalists, which you guys can actually talk a little bit about. So I'm not going to talk about that so much. But again, journalists don't have quite, I think there's a myth that it's more of a norm than a law, this blanket right of source protection. So, there is protection for journalists, but it's not as robust or consistent as it is for attorneys. So that's important to know. And also, their agenda is not going to be the same as yours. And we have noticed that working with journalists, unless there are journalists working in the intelligence community who understand source protection and the risk involved with dealing with the source, they're not so as good, actually. They want the information and they don't necessarily think about the risk to the source. So even though it might not be a crime to report something, that doesn't mean someone's not going to experience reprisal or even be threatened with criminal prosecution as a form of retaliation. We have that happen to several whistleblowers who are not disclosing classified information. They're still threatened with either theft or criminal investigation and prosecution as a harassment tool. So your journalist, wants that information in that story, they're not necessarily going to have the same interest of the client at heart. So then thinking about accessing their information differently, this is where we'll get into FOIA, but also matchmaking with Congress or agencies to be able to say, here's a bridge, here's a disclosure, to have Congress or an agency try to get the information. So they're covering for the whistleblower. And again, just that trust piece, the more information you have about the risk the source is taking and giving them information to support and their decision to blow the whistle and how to use the information in a way that is safe and effective, it engenders trust. And your knowledge of those risks really helps telegraph to them, oh, these are people I can work with. And you'll get more information. So again, you have these orange guides that are for public interest organizations on working with whistleblowers, so I'm not going to focus so much on these tips because they're in the guides, and I just want to emphasize that. But I'm not shopping for clients, we have plenty to do, but talk to an experienced lawyer. And I do say that because we get that people are speaking because they want to make a difference. That is the whole thing about whistleblowing. They are speaking because they want to make a difference. Lawyers who get that dance between protection and advocacy are super important, whereas sometimes the private bar who aren't like in the public interest space are just like, don't say anything because you're going to suffer reprisal, which is not really necessarily consistent with the goals of the client. So being able to navigate what that strategy is about is important. Create a paper trail or a diary. So this is advice you can give to whistleblowers. Document, take notes. It is super important to have that. Keep evidence in a safe place. I mean, you guys can actually talk about some of this stuff potentially, but I'm not going to get into the details of like actual source protection beyond the basics. Organize support among coworkers. That's super important. Secure and protect evidence without removing it. Zach, you can maybe talk a little bit about that. Communicate using secure means. So we use Signal all the time. You can get Proton mail accounts. Don't talk during work hours or using work equipment because their fingerprints are all over then, and they can also be subject to claims of, we're firing you because you weren't doing work during work hours. So even if it's pretextual, turn off location tracking on your phone, make sure a large number of people possess documents, which makes it much easier if you're doing a FOIA request, for instance, to not have it try back to the source. I just had this zip here. We are working on trying to strengthen whistleblower protection for federal employees that would give them a right to a jury trial like the contractors have, protecting them from retaliatory investigations, having consequences to supervisors, personal consequences to supervisors who retaliate, and getting interim relief. Weird. Because, it's a 10-year battle sometimes to litigate these cases, and that is really vulnerable when you're just an employee and you don't have the resources of the federal government or a corporation to fight, that's just a really hard battle to wage. So we have a sign-on letter that we're trying to, get as much support from a diversity of public interest organizations to advocate for strengthened whistleblower protections, because when whistleblowers are protected, public interest organizations have more information and it makes democracy work and all those things that we're here to talk about. So I'm just gonna leave that up here for a second before we get to the FOIA stuff. But if you contact legislationintern@whistleblower.org or just give me your card, when you're interested in joining that sign-on letter, we'd be really grateful. So I'm gonna, do you have any questions? I just talked a lot and I'm sorry about that. Do you have any burning questions right now? So, no, yeah.
A lot of the whistle discussed with
yeah, so for instance, when I went, oh dear, sorry. That's annoying. So here, there's actually a list of like 26 laws that could be under here. These employee protection provisions under the different statutes. So I didn't list them all. These are just examples. Oh, I lost wrong with the extra comma. These actually protect corporate employees. So I don't have the full list. We will have a database soon on our website of all of the laws that protect corporate employees structured. So you will be able to find that more easily. But these actually protect corporate employees. They don't always actually protect federal employees. So these are under the employee protection provisions found in different statutes. So that's one place. I think a lot of the state laws also offer protections for corporate employees. Dodd-Frank, the financial regulations, SEC, the consumer, there's like the consumer safety, it's like the parallel to Dodd-Frank, the consumer, I can't remember the name of it, it's the consumer safety something. Those all protect corporate employees, and not just contractors, just corporate employees. So if there's a law that is regulating activity, you need to look and see if there's an employee protection provision in it. There often is. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, yes.
And then, do these laws apply to non-employees?
No, some of them. Some of them do. It's complicated. So some of them do. Some of the financial laws, particularly, have provision. They don't define a whistleblower as an employee. But most of them do, and most of it's part of your prima facie case is actually to show that it's an employee. So I would say the majority of them are employment laws. The financial ones are with some exceptions. Okay, yeah.
What is it?
Yeah, so there's, well, and of course it depends because all the laws are different. But you have to show, for instance, that typically it's an employee, there's an employee, and then you have to show there's an employer, and so on all of these different parts of the prima facie case, when you're bringing a whistleblower claim, each one can be argued. So for instance, if let's say it's a subcontractor, you'd have to make the case of, you'd have to do like an agency analysis to see whether or not that employer had enough control over the subcontractor's work to be able to be considered an employer, for instance, unless they're defined as an employer in the statute. Not to make it more complicated, but each little factoid can be a problem, showing that you're an employee, showing that you're an employer. Then you would have to show that you made a protected disclosure. So you blew the whistle on something that fits into the scope of the act. It's either, a substantial and specific danger to public health and safety, or it's a potential violation of one of the statutes. If there's an employee protection provision in it, then you have to show that the employer knew that you blew the whistle. So you have to show employer knowledge, which is actually why that anonymity piece becomes important too, that why being anonymous is not always your best friend legally, because sometimes the employer can figure out who it is. But if they've done it through kind of secret ways, by sussing out through like looking at a hotline and like illegally or whatever, if you're more public in your disclosure, it's much easier to show the employer knew that I blew the whistle. And then you have to show that you suffered retaliation. So you have to show the retaliation element. And then the employer gets to, the burden would shift back to the employer to show whether or not that was because of the reprisal. And whether or not it's pretextual, so they would get to say, no, I actually fired them because they were, late to work twice, even though other people are late to work all the time who haven't blown the whistle and have never been fired. So then you have to show that the employer's reason for the reprisal is pretextual, and then you have to show damages. So that's I don't know if that helps, but that's basically how the prima facie case, or how a whistleblower case in terms of the burdens of proof shift. And the burdens of proof are actually also really different from a lawyer's perspective. They're usually pretty good actually for once you're in that space for the whistleblower. So any other questions? Yeah, so I'm getting the time thing to hand it over to Zach.
I'm next?
You're
okay.
Next.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Dana. One of the big points was sources. It's not always the best to be anonymous, but I work with a lot of sources, and the reality is no matter what you tell them, a lot of times they still want to be anonymous. They're not playing a legal case. They have different goals sometimes than what you might say the best practice is. And so I have more perspective on working with that kind of on the ground in reality, what actually happens when you are dealing with a source. And so I just kind of want to give some tips about how to protect them the best you can when you're working with them, while just kind of going with whatever they want and how they want to do things. And so like the first thing to be clear, and Dan talked about this a little bit, is a lot of these sources really don't know what they're doing, and you kind of need to educate them on how to stay safe. So that's, again, don't call me on your work phone where your boss can go look and be like, who is this number? Don't use your work computer. Don't go take pictures of classified information, like screenshot on your computer, print out a page where the government can go track you, all these kind of basic things. And then there's a couple things where, like, we have a full list of tips in these guides on what to tell your sources. But one that I've always thought is interesting in going into FOIA is, like, let's say I send a FOIA for like a very specific document that my source, generally it's like, oh, we suggest sending FOIAs to help protect your source so it's not obvious something is leaked. But like, what if only 4 people know about this document? It's pretty obvious, especially if like 3 are management and 1's your source who's not management. And then you FOIA this document, they're like, how did anyone know about this? Well, obviously someone leaked it. So little tips like let's say your document's not classified, it can be shared around the agency. Your source, if you tell your source this, they can find a pretext to like send a listserv email to everyone in the agency about a document. Just like put the document, attach it on the listserv email, and then suddenly like 200 people have the document, and it might be much harder for them to track down who leaked it, especially because they may not associate your source with being the one who leaked it because they emailed it. They may think, oh man, now everyone got it and someone leaked it right after that. It's way harder for them. So you kind of want to educate your source on like how to protect themselves, kind of how to go into this clear-eyed, talk to their family, see what they're really willing to risk and what they want to do. And also just to like do, again, the basic source protection. Like, don't use your work computer. If you think there's any risk of being spied on, use Signal, use WhatsApp, and they're pretty easy and user-friendly to use. Delete your messages, keep stuff at home so that it's much harder for your boss can search your desk, they can't search your house. And so just basic stuff like that, and everything's in these guides. So that's kind of the baseline practical, like you need to educate any source you're working with and figure out where they are, what they understand, and what they're feeling. And so then let's say you have this source, and I'm going to give you a completely not true example that I'm completely making up, and don't take this as real because it's not, but is based on something that we've worked with and it's kind of an analog to something that is actually going on with GAP right now. So pretend you have an ICE agent who comes to you from like Brownsville, Texas, and they tell you, this is actually very, like this is not happening in real life at all, but it's something similar to like what we're aware of. And they tell you that ICE has secretly been murdering illegal immigrants, and they cross the border and ICE shoots them in the head and buries them in an unmarked grave. But they have records of this that they've secretly disguised as saying that ICE was transferring them to another facility. And that's how they were disguising all these murders they were committing. And you know your one ICE agent has come to you and said, I'm in Brownsville, Texas. I watched this happen with my own eyes. It's real, but I'm afraid to come out and do this. I can't come out. And even if they know their whistleblower protections, often they're like, I'm going to lose all my friends. I'm going to be harassed. Like, there's plenty of extra legal things that can cause people to be afraid of coming out publicly. So they're not willing to do it. And there's no way you can go out with this thing and say, in Brownsville, Texas, this is what's happening. And we know this is happening with our anonymous source because, again, let's say in an ICE office, maybe there might be a bunch of people in that office who are white supremacists, fully on board with the agenda, and they might be able to figure out pretty quickly who the leaker was, who tipped off about their illegal murders, again, which are not happening in real life. I made this example up, so I'm not saying ICE is murdering people, but this is just the hypothetical. So if you find a little piece of data in the disclosure from the whistleblower, you could actually think about crafting this into a FOIA and say, wait a second, they said they were disguising, for example, their murders in this set of data. And who is to say that this isn't happening all over the country? And so can I grab that little piece of data and can I make a larger project out of this and try and find trends and like ask for all the ICE data on people who are being sent across or being disappeared in this way, and then say, well, what if I find 5 cases? Then it's no longer my guy in Brownsville, Texas. And it's going to be much harder for them to narrow down how I found it or even realize I found it from a source rather than completely on accident in a data request. So that's actually a much more valuable way to look for information rather than just narrowing down on a specific document, is if you can also think about it as how do I do broad data in my FOIAs and in my stories and in my work, it's a much more useful way to protect your sources if they're not willing to come out publicly. And on this note, even outside of FOIA, so I'm working on a story right now that I've been working on. We published one thing a year ago in Politico about the au pair program, which is basically, in my opinion, a quasi-slave labor, domestic labor, foreign domestic labor work program. And it's really hard to catch someone who's a source when you have someone come to you, then you find 160 other sources. And so if you just sit there and do a lot of work, finding a lot of other people, and you take it more as different data points, where I can say now, like, so basically to explain this program, it's a quasi public-private partnership where these private companies are exploiting young women, and many times, who are now working with host families, and many times they're limited to only working 45 hours a week, but families are making them work way more than 45 hours. They're working overtime. And they're telling these companies that are like the middlemen contracting them that we're basically working slave hours, and the companies are required to report that to the government, but they don't. And so one thing you can do is, what I've done is found more au pairs who have evidence of reporting to their companies that they were working extra hours than the companies reported to the government. And it's hard to narrow down on any specific target who's not openly out there speaking publicly and go after them when it's just different data points. And so that's just a good way to think about source protection. Is it's safety in numbers, it's safety in broad kind of like things that can't be tracked and narrowed down to a specific person. And it's honestly, in my opinion, a way more powerful thing to show a broad trend of misconduct than a specific point. And so that's how I try and think about things in general. And the last little point just on working is this isn't really a piece of advice, it's just sort of personal reflection. And so I'm going to say this is not about GAP, because GAP is a nonpartisan organization and we work with people of all stripes. And in a way, this is actually about this. I personally, again, not GAP, sort of end up on the left side of the spectrum. I would suspect many people in this room do. And we work with people who are very, very different in their views and their lives than I am. So we actually work with one ICE whistleblower, this guy named Jason Piccolo, who exposed, basically ICE was turning over minors to sex traffickers, I think, and other people who had criminal felonies. Now, I wouldn't speak for Jason. He's done a ton of Fox News interviews that he kind of shares his views, and I don't really agree with them. But I don't think, for example, he'd be so opposed to the child detention as a solution, because at least, again, you're not turning them over to sex traffickers. I do not agree with this in my personal politics at all, but sometimes you do have to work with these people who you don't disagree with, and it's not easy. I mean, so like I'll go change, like I'll kind of go maybe clean up my Twitter a little bit if I know that I'm talking to a source who might disagree with me. Also, I'm working right now with a bunch of military contractors, and so my current Twitter handle is like prosecute DHS leadership. Like I go like remove that when I'm going to go, I know I'm about to talk to a source who might disagree, because you don't want to openly antagonize them. But again, there may be discomfort also, and you can find someone in your organization. We have a coworker who's very good at just kind of like working with national security types, with working with like the ex-Marines. That I can't talk that language. You kind of just find a way to work with it, and it's something you have to do when you're working with these people, because especially being in this community right here, I imagine you don't agree with. I know some ICE agents, actually, you may not believe this, would agree with most of your beliefs. But I know some would agree 100 or disagree 100%, and you might just have to work with them. And you find a way to do it basically and separate that from everything else. And they're still valuable as people to work with, even if you wouldn't want to get a beer with them. That's like the best way I can put it. It's still important, and it really is something you just have to get used to. And so, okay, anyway, so if I'm out of my time, does anyone have any questions about kind of specifics? I can kind of talk to anyone about source generation if they want. I don't know if I would do it like, it's way more complicated than I think we can do right now, but if anyone wants to talk about anything, I'm really happy to answer. No one has questions?
All right.
All right.
Oh, here.
Okay.
Cool. Make sure that works. Great. Okay. So who I know we kind of ran through this, but just quick show of hands. Who's filed a Public Records or Freedom of Information Act request before? Okay, that is awesome. So I hope for people who have not and who are interested in, I hope you leave today and start thinking about some FOIA requests you can file. I think the main takeaway is that it's something that you get better at with practice, but it shouldn't be intimidating. So even if you're not a lawyer, even if you're not somebody who spent years and years working on this stuff, I think FOIA is a good skill for anybody to have. Even if you're not directly filing FOIA requests, better understanding the process and better getting a sense of what FOIA can and can't do, I think is really valuable. I had only personally filed about 3 public records requests before I decided to devote the rest of my life to this. So hopefully everybody else in this room will as well. So I run Muckrock. We're a nonprofit based up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We've helped file just over 50,000 public records requests. We've worked with about 20,000 different people filing those requests, and we filed with 11,000 different agencies. So we do a lot of federal work. About 40% of our work is at the federal level, and about 60% of work is state and local. And we've helped release about 2.1 million pages of documents through that process, not including about 13 million pages we won from the CIA in a lawsuit early last year, and then a few other data archives that we had figured out how to actually move around all that data. But it's key question of when people start getting into FOIA is sort of like how do you get started? I think the process can be really intimidating. If you go on some of the different like forums and that sort of thing, you'll find that people are like, ooh, everybody wants sort of magic language that they can throw in their FOIA request that's released. And you see all these people kind of pass around, ooh, I use this phrase with the FBI to get some release stuff. One requester I know was like really excited. He's like, Michael, give everybody my 20-page template of FOIA request magic. And I took a look at it, and it was like rambling nonsense that had like mixed federal and state citations. He was like sending a request to Pennsylvania, and he cited both the federal law as well as Tennessee law for some reason. I was like, this doesn't actually apply. And then when I talk with FOIA officers, and I'm actually a member of the American Society of Access Professionals, which is ASAP, the trade association of FOIA officers. And the biggest complaint they have is like people sending 20-page requests that they can't figure out what they're actually asking for. So try and keep it simple, but the key to a good request is research. And the key to a good request is kind of getting to specific requests. So for people who haven't filed FOIA requests, one of the first stumbling blocks a lot of people run into is FOIA is a little bit like Jeopardy in terms of you can ask for anything you want, but you have to ask for it in the form of a document. You can't ask the government question. You can't say, using this hypothetical example earlier, you can't say, hey, how many people have you secretly murdered? You have to find, hey, give me the documentation showing how many people you secretly murdered, which is a little bit of a nuance, but it's something that agencies do take very seriously. And so as you're sort of thinking through how can I use FOIA, as you're sort of thinking through how can I sort of get something out of the government, if that answers my question, think through, the goal is to sort of in the research phase, think through what are the documents or data that are going to answer the question you might have. Ideally, you have a name of a document. If you can say, hey, this administrator said, oh, based on the report that we had commissioned last week done by this group, we're going to take this action. If you can figure out what's the name of that report, what's the name of that document, what's the name of that form, that makes it a lot easier for you to go to the agency and say, hey, I want this exact form, this exact document. A lot of times, however, you don't know that. Ideally, you can tell the agency who has the document. I think one of the things that it's really easy to underestimate, especially if you work at a nonprofit or a relatively small organization, is just how massive, complicated, bureaucratic, and poorly organized most government agencies are. Even relatively small agencies, state agencies, the left hand doesn't know what the right is doing. Other things you're looking for to make request specifics is sort of if you have sort of external reasons that you know that document exists, let the agency know, hey, this administrator mentioned this document, or I saw this document referenced in a footnote. What you want to do is get as specific as you can with document requests and FOIA requests, so that the agency knows exactly what you're looking for, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we are a nonprofit. People use our site to file FOIA requests. Like I mentioned, about 50,000 requests have been filed through the site. So if you're looking for request ideas, just stealing other people's request ideas. That's how I got started in FOIA. Is I just kind of like went around. I looked at FOIA logs. I looked at sort of news stories over the years. I went back and I read through a lot of like really great investigative reporting about projects. And I just kind of like reverse engineer. It's like, okay, in the 90s, the Washington Post wrote this really great story about asset forfeiture. I looked at the documents that they based those stories on and sort of figured out, oh, I'm going to reverse engineer this other stuff to file new requests and see if things have changed. One of the great things about government is usually the scandals don't change. If something was horrible and corrupt 10 years ago, it's probably horrible and corrupt today. So that makes it easy to kind of continue doing our work. And then if you see an interesting request, people file requests publicly and then the documents actually come back online in sort of real time. And so if somebody else has filed a request that you're interested in, you can just click follow this request if you have a BuckRock account and sort of get updates as they do, and maybe save yourself a FOIA. In the research phase, I think one of the best things is the best request to file is the one you don't have to file at all. And so figuring out if your information you want is already out there can save you months and months. And we've had a few cases where I filed a request with an agency and they said, oh, these documents don't exist. And then I got annoyed and started digging a little bit deeper, and the documents not only existed, but were posted on their website, which makes the agency dumb for claiming they don't exist and makes me look dumb for not knowing how to Google better. Other resources in terms of sort of figuring out sort of what documents does an agency have. Agencies open websites. Under the law, every agency is supposed to have a FOIA reading room online. Most agencies do actually have now FOIA reading rooms. Some of those FOIA reading rooms actually have documents in them, not all of them. But they are getting better and better. Before you start filing FOIA requests, it's always a good idea to kind of check and see, okay, what has the agency posted previously? You got to get a sense of what documents are other people requesting. A lot of agencies post their FOIA request logs. Under the Freedom of Information Act, other Freedom of Information Act requests are requestable. So you can see, oh, what have other people been able to get out of this agency? This is really useful because the vast majority of requests are filed by commercial interests. They're filed by people who are lawyers on behalf of whistleblowers and that sort of thing. And so a lot of really smart people kind of know exactly where all the bodies are buried and have kind of started to set up very specific requests, and you can use those language to get ideas for your own requests. Agency records retention schedules. If you've got a summer vacation coming up and you're interested in a specific federal agency, I highly recommend downloading your favorite agency's records retention schedule. Usually a couple 100-page PDF, print it out, take it to the beach or on your Kindle, and you can kind of see all the different documents that agencies have, and as well as like how long they need to keep them. One of the things we found is that a lot of times people see sort of obstruction or obfuscation from behalf of agencies, and it's really just agencies not being very creative and sort of understanding what you mean and not speaking their lingo. If you look through a records retention schedule, you can go to the agency and say, under the law, you have to keep an incident database system active for 5 years. I want 5 years worth of your incident database. And be able to kind of cite the exact documents, cite the exact timeline of how long they have to keep that information. it's not foolproof, but it's a very good way to kind of get a sense of, especially if you're not really sure, you know you want to dig into ICE or you know you want to dig into education. The records retention schedule can kind of give you ideas for all the different types of documents that an agency makes. One of the other things I found is that government agency websites are like not the most navigable. This is kind of surprising, but once I started going to places besides government agency websites, see, the internet's evolved a little bit faster than agencies have. So one of the things I found is right down at the bottom of that slide. Everybody's heard of Google? Okay, I haven't checked it out. Check it out. Great website, a bunch of other cool stuff on there. But one of my favorite features about Google is you can type in a keyword that you care about. Maybe that's school lunches. Maybe that's you know, environmental policy, whatever. Figure out some keywords and then type in file type : PDF, site : and then either .gov if you want to return all .gov results, or you can just type in site : and the specific agency you care about. And a lot of times it'll return back stuff that the agency's posted that it's not really easy to find on their website, or stuff that the agency hasn't even realized it posted. A few years ago, we found out that the Marine Corps had accidentally posted most of its entire declassified intranet. So its internal websites were all just accidentally online, and I came across that by just using this kind of Google tip. And then file type : the government loves PDFs. Most people don't, but governments are really, that's kind of how they communicate. PDFs, PowerPoints, so PPT, PPTX, XLS, XLSX for spreadsheets. And a lot of times you can find really fascinating documents that just a normal Google search won't pull up, or just kind of going through a government's agency website won't pull up. So kind of going back and sort of seeing maybe get results in 3 seconds as opposed to 3 months. By making sure it's not already posted. And if you find something similar to what you posted, now you know, okay, here's a document that existed a year ago, I want an updated version of it, that sort of thing. So doing some of this background research can help you file a much more better specific FOIA request. Another website, so we actually just merged Document Cloud's another nonprofit, or was another nonprofit, now it's the same nonprofit as Muckrock. Has anybody heard of Document Cloud? Okay, so more people than have heard of Google, that's good. So this is like YouTube for government documents, just hundreds of millions of pages of previously released government documents that have been released to other news organizations. A lot of this through FOIA, but also through leaks, also through reports. Everything on here is sort of like from vetted news organizations, so you don't have to worry about going through some less reliable stuff. But it's a really useful resource for kind of getting a sense of what documents exist. What forms do different agencies use? What have people previously found interesting from a given agency? Everything on Muckrock that's public gets piped through Document Cloud as well, and it's just a really good way to kind of do some background research, kind of see if something's previously been released, or get ideas. And I think going back to the idea of the best request is one where you can kind of say, hey, I want this exact form number from this exact date. This can help you figure out what are those exact form numbers. What are things to look for when you're doing kind of background research? You're looking for names, form numbers, reports. Look for footnotes and citations. One of my favorite requesters, one of his favorite tips is every time like an agency, especially an intelligence agency, releases a report, going through and sort of looking up all the footnotes and then filing a FOIA request for everything mentioned in a footnote. If, you know, because usually there's other internal studies, there are other internal databases that get referenced. And if you can point to that footnote and say, hey, I want what was mentioned in that footnote, the agency can't be like, I don't know what you're talking about, because they already acknowledged it. And then thinking about what documents naturally kind of flow from the other documents you've already discovered. So if you've got an individual case file, if you've got an individual incident report, one thing the government loves doing is sort of compiling annual summaries of stuff. So think through, what are the annual summaries that would categorize this report or index this report? Agencies love indexing stuff, and so think through, what are the overall larger views that this document might lead to, and then what are the more granular views. So if you have an index, trying to drill down from that index and get to the exact details you want is a really useful strategy. One of the things I always recommend is sort of, as we are sort of public investigators, we kind of care about the public interest. Agencies sort of A lot of it's driven by sort of bureaucracy, it's driven by process. There's a lot of really good reasons for that, but it's a very different mentality than we might come through. So taking a step back and sort of saying, okay, I know this is what I want because it really matters to the public to get this out there, or this is an important public policy question, and then sort of think through what is the paper, what is the documentation, what are the processes that lead to this, what are the contracts that would need to be signed, the agreements that need to be made, what are the privacy impact assessments that would have to be done before we roll out this program, and sort of start thinking through sort of if I was a middle manager in charge of this program, if I was a bureaucrat and I wanted to make sure I never personally got in trouble for this, what are all the forms I would make everybody else sign so that I ensure I have no personal culpability, and then start thinking through how do you request those. So it's always really useful to kind of take a step back and really kind of put yourself like, if I was right in the middle of that organization, what is all the paper that I'd be flowing to and from me, and start using that to kind of frame your FOIA request. So once you've done some background research, hopefully you've already found your document and you can save yourself a FOIA. But if you can't, things to think about when actually writing a FOIA request. What makes a good request? Clearly defined. Don't ask for any and all documents about X. That's something agencies really, really hate. One thing agencies like doing is not having to do sort of any personal judgment. I think one of the things that sort of as a requester isn't intuitively obvious, but we say, I want any and all documents about whatever, then they have to sort of figure out, well, is this document really about it? It just mentions it. That's something that if you ask a friend, hey, can you give me everything you have on this? They can kind of figure that out. If you're talking to an agency, they kind of freak out. So try and think of a FOIA, sort of like a hyper-literal genie that will kind of interpret your request in the worst possible way, and very, very slowly. And try to figure out how do you make sure you get what you want and only get what you want. Set date parameters for any request. A lot of agencies have been around for a long, long time. And so sort of you can say, okay, I only want documents between this date and this date. That's going to be really helpful. If you don't want to miss anything, if you're digging into something that's a relatively current issue, you can say, hey, I want any documents created between January 1st, 2001, and then the date this request is processed so that you don't miss anything current. But whenever it makes sense, setting date parameters is something that can save you some time and effort and also make sure the agency knows exactly what you're looking for. Tips on who might have it and how to find it. Any kind of advice that you can give the agency on sort of where this document might be located. Agencies are very big. FOIA offices are usually the offices that nobody else wants to sit with at lunch, so they don't really know what's going on in their agency a lot of times. FOIA officers are wonderful people, and some of them have been super helpful over time, but the reality is that the public gives them a lot of grief in internal agencies. Everybody else inside the agency, the FOIA office is like the bad guys who add more work and just get them in trouble. So if you can give the FOIA office ideas on terms of where this document is located, how you know this document exists, if it's not from a confidential source, or it can be very, very helpful at narrowing it down. Explaining your status. If you're going to be working on a media article about this, if you're going to do a blog post on this, and you can show you have an audience through your organization, you should get media requester status so that they can charge you minimal fees, if any. And you just want to make sure you're not marked as a commercial requester unless you are a commercial requester, because that comes with a ton of fees. Citing how you know a document exists, I just think if you can sort of say, hey, this was mentioned in the records retention schedule, hey, the president mentioned this in a tweet, hey, I saw this in a footnote, it makes it a lot harder for the agency to come back and say this doesn't exist. Because a lot of times agencies, if they get a FOIA request, the easiest thing for them to do is kind of pick a department at random, sort of say, hey, do you know if this document exists? That department's like, I don't know what they're talking about. Then they come back and say, no responsive documents exist. So if you can kind of make it harder for them to say something doesn't exist, that's going to be a lot better. And then having fun and being creative. I think one of the things is there's more and weirder things that you can request, and sort of all sorts of like interesting documents that can tell really important stories if you're kind of creative in terms of going out. We've helped file FOIA requests for source code. We've helped file FOIA requests for camera footage. Somebody asked for a bunch of public transportation messages, so like the pre-recorded things that says stand clear of the closing door and that sort of thing. Probably not going to break any important investigative stories, but you never know. So being creative in terms of thinking through what are the documents when you put on your Ron Swanson hat, sort of thinking through what are all the different kinds of interesting documents that come back. Assume your FOIA request is going to get passed around. I think I was talking with somebody at the DoD, and they said on average requests to the DoD go through 12 different people. So it's like a game of telephone. Some of those people are barely going to know how to operate a telephone. Some of those people are maybe they're going to be IT department and they don't really know how FOIA works. So kind of making sure your request is very clear, concise. Don't bury your request in 13 pages of legalese, but making sure that somebody who's very technical and can understand it. Make sure somebody who their first day at the agency can sort of make sure it gets passed on to the right person. Really important. Understand that the left hand often has no idea what the right hand is doing within government. A lot of times it can be seen very much like there's a conspiracy to kind of stop stuff from getting out there, and sometimes that does indeed happen. But the majority of the time is that the agency they're just incompetent, or it's a complicated agency where people are not all in one big room. But I've had FOIA requests kind of fly all around the world. I once asked for a copy of a document that was sitting on a general's toilet seat, whatever you call the back of the toilet, and so like they had to and they actually got the document. They rejected releasing it, but they did, so this is going through a lot of hops literally all over the world, and sort of keeping track of sort of like how do you make sure this helps flow. Agencies, a lot of times FOIA officers, especially in the last few years, they made a concerted effort to try to be more customer service friendly. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that, but a lot of FOIA officers really do care about what they're doing, and they really do believe in their mission. And so they want to talk through on the phone. They want to make sure they understand your request. And a lot of times they'll have really helpful suggestions for you. You can talk in a more informal environment, and it helps them get a little less freaked out. A lot of times they'll see something, they'll feel very aggressive to them, and talking through stuff, they can be a little more blunt and frank via phone versus what they want to put in writing. And then trying to think like a FOIA officer, trying to think through, okay, what are their incentives? How can you make it easy for them to make it easy for you to get the documents you want? It can be a really helpful process. And then once you've sort of written that request, it's kind of all about the follow through. One of the things I always recommend is kind of assuming good faith. They're not necessarily acting in good faith, but usually if you kind of kill them with kindness and kind of say, well, shucks, that's weird. You don't know how to like export an email. Let me walk you through that process. Or, kind of plain, kind of just giving them the benefit of the doubt. If they're acting maliciously, usually they'll just make things worse for themselves. But a lot of times I was talking with an agency that wanted thousands of dollars for a few emails. And so we got on the phone with them and we told them, oh, and you're using Outlook. You can literally just drag and drop emails from your email client onto the desktop. And they're like, oh, wow, I was going to fax you all these, but now I can, and we went from $1,000 to free with a 15-minute phone call. And that happens all the time where agencies, they're not given good training. FOIA is not a huge priority. And so if you're willing to talk and kind of work with people, sometimes that can unblock stuff in surprising ways. Under the Federal Freedom of Information Act, agencies are required to give you an estimated completion date for your request. So if you're trying to kind of keep things moving along, ask a federal agency for that estimated completion date. The downside to that is that estimated completion date doesn't have to be based in fact, but it can be helpful for kind of nudging an agency along and saying, hey, you said this is going to be done in 2 weeks. Just want to make sure it's on track. Let me know what I can do. Interview the response. I think what we've kind of talked about is that government documents are not the word of God, to put it lightly. But agencies, even well-meaning databases, and this is particularly true with government databases, reports, incident reports, kind of make sure you understand the context of what that report was generated, understand the political motivations going into it, and not political Republican versus Democrat, but sort of like, hey, I want to keep my job, I don't want to rock the boat. Usually it's sort of like keeping the humming bureaucracy flowing is sort of can lead documents to do weird things. So, or a lot of times we have databases that are sort of self-reported incidents. And if you were like, wow, nobody in Minnesota got into a near-miss plane crash, it might just be nobody in Minnesota bothered to let the FAA know because it's all self-reported data. Play different agencies off each other. One of the things we found, I think this is particularly helpful when you're looking at immigration-related issues, is kind of asking for stuff from both a federal agency and a local agency. They're going to redact different stuff. One of them is going to get back quicker than the other, and you can kind of play that information off each other and kind of sort of say, oh, I was able to get this local information, then I'm going to file a new federal request based on information or vice versa. Can be really, really useful, particularly if you're getting around agencies that are just kind of stonewalling you or saying, I don't think this exists. One of my favorite examples, we did a project looking at drone usage around the United States. City of San Diego said we've never looked at drones. City of Seattle gave us a signed contract from the chief of police in the city of San Diego saying we're going to buy some drones. So that was just playing two, I never would have guessed that Seattle was going to give us San Diego related documents, but they did. They had them, they gave them. And then appealing, about 30% of the federal appeals end up releasing more documents. So you don't have to be a lawyer. If you are a lawyer, it probably helps, but using the appeals process, both at the federal level and at the state level, not enough people do it. It usually 1/3 of the time releases more documents. It's free, it's not complicated. And basically it's like going to a store, not being happy with your service, saying, I want to speak to your manager, except here it's a good thing to do. I want to talk a little bit about some of the projects we've done. So for the past 4-ish years, we've run the private prison project. One of our reporters, Beryl Lipton's been kind of leading that up, and using a lot of FOIA requests around the country to kind of take a broad look. And so this project's involved hundreds and hundreds of requests and getting really good comparative data around a specific issue. And I think this is a great example of sort of casting a wide net and then using as results kind of come back in, sort of use that to file more FOIA requests, kind of picking out details and being able to kind of, like an agency says, oh, we can't release this, pointing to other agencies that have previously released that can be really helpful, or kind of comparing and using different jurisdictions releasing different information. Help fill in the blanks can be a really, really helpful process. That's just a map of all the FOIA requests we filed for that process. And then one of the things we found is that we've done a lot of crowdsourced FOIA projects where we sort of start filing some requests, we create a template, and then we say, hey, if you have some specific information, or if you want to know what's going on in your specific town, provide us a little bit of information and we'll file a FOIA request based on that project, based on that feedback. And it's a good way to kind of channel sort of people's interests, people's on-the-ground knowledge into local requests that can help shine a broader light on trends and that sort of thing. And so we've done this on a variety of issues, but just kind of saying, hey, let us know if we want us to file a specific request in a specific town or around a specific case that you know about. Gives people kind of a clear call to action, a clear sort of way that they can feel that their knowledge can be helpful for a larger issue they care about, and can release some really, really interesting results. Some of our biggest stories have come out based on just tips that we got from people who they don't know the full story, but they just feel something's weird, something's wrong, or they're actually a government employee and they don't want to be a whistleblower, quote unquote. They don't see themselves as that, but they do sort of say, hey, file a request here, and see what comes back. And a lot of times that's led to really interesting and surprising. A little more detail on appealing. The Reporters Committee for the Press has a really great resource called the FOIA Wiki. It's at foia.wiki. That's the no.com or anything like that. Really, really good resource in terms of understanding ways to get around FOIA, federal FOIA exemptions. And then they have the Open Government Guide is a really good resource for state and local public records laws. muckrock.com/place is our database of state guides. So we have pretty in-depth guides to every state's public records law. And then we have a database of sort of exemptions around the country and sort of sample appeals you can steal. Also, the Office of Government Information Services and state attorney generals post a lot of their decisions. So if you're trying to sort of see, hey, how can I get around this exemption, or what can I request? Both of those can be really good resources on sort of what you're going at. We at Muckrock, we run a free weekly chat most Fridays around noon Eastern. We have where we just get together and talk public records issues, but it's 24/7. There's a bunch of FOIA experts, public records experts in there. We just love nerding out on FOIA requests. If you have questions, if you got something you're working on, if you have a big FOIA win you want to share, we have a group of transparency nerds that love hearing about that stuff, love offering advice, love helping people file their first FOIA request. A group called the National Free Information Coalition There's state coalitions, so almost every state has a group, and DC has a group focused on sort of local public records issues. Those are really, really great resources. Most of them have free hotlines that all of them feel, have more capacity to answer questions, that sort of thing. So if you're interested in the local state issues, highly recommend that. And then there's NFOC also runs something called the FOIA listserv. That's just like an email mailing list for people where you can ask questions and sort of say, hey, this is someone interested in, anybody run into this before. There are some interesting folks on there. It's a pretty unmoderated list, but so it can be a really good resource as well. Yeah, and then if you got questions or want to follow up on something, I'm just info@muckrock.com or michael@muckrock.com.
Do you want to have any questions for Michael? Yes. Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Is the estimation
So yeah, so some agents, so every agency has a queue of requests, and so they try to estimate that based on reality. I think one of the things that goes into that is sort of how complex your request is. But under the law, they don't have to be based in reality. I think there was actually a court decision that said, like, even if they just throw a dart at a dartboard, all they have to do is provide you a date. It doesn't have to be accurate. But I know a lot of agencies do try to keep that, especially the more conscientious ones. They do try to set expectations because they want people to be happy. So it varies agency to agency.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll that will that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll talk to Chris.
Yes, email. Is it right now? Yeah, fine. Oh. Yay.
All right, thanks. Is this one up?
Oh, it's not. Right.
There you go. All right. Thanks so much. So as I'm kind of going through, please feel free to just interrupt with questions, and we'll kind of get into like the more interactive part now, because there's been so much really great knowledge shared here. And what I'm going to say, a lot of it has been covered because Michael is such like the premier expert in FOIA, and all these tips are so key. And everything that that Dana and Zach has said has been so crucial. So just jump in, please, as I'm going through. And I'm going to get through kind of some of these best case examples of where FOIA has been successful in actually getting information. And as I'm going through, if you have stories also of where you've had FOIA successes or FOIA challenges, and then we can kind of workshop through, how to get over these obstacles, because the obstacles are many, and there are a lot of different strategies and tools to get around them. So maybe we can kind of go through those as we're moving through my chat here. So just a little bit about, my name is Jesse Franzel. I work for Open the Government. It's a coalition. It's an inclusive, nonpartisan coalition that works to strengthen that works to strengthen our democracy and empower the public by advancing policies that create a more open, accountable, and responsive government. We're a coalition of over 100 organizations now, public interest organizations, and we work to bring together groups and really organize around openness, access to information, and accountability, government accountability issues. And so one thing we've done, a lot of our partner organizations like MuckRock and GAP do some incredible work around FOIA. And so we work to pull together stories about where FOIA is successful, and especially where collaborative FOIA work is successful. And we put all this information up on the FOIA wiki that the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press runs, that Michael mentioned. So take a look there, and all of this is there. And we invite folks to add their own stories, their own successes. And we'll probably add a section for FOIA challenges, and then, to kind of get more thinking about how to overcome obstacles again, as I mentioned. I'm going to go through a couple of these case studies that we looked at. One of the first ones which is incredibly relevant now and has been for the last 10 years probably, the organization Detention Watch Network, which is part of our coalition, teamed up with the Center for Constitutional Rights several years ago to try to get information about private detention facilities. This was years ago when private detention was just expanding massively under the last administration as they were detaining more and more people and targeting more undocumented communities for detention. So they teamed up to try to get documents, the contracts, the information about these private companies that are housing detained migrants. They went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The private companies intervened in this case to try to fight the disclosure of this information. So even when ICE said, fine, we'll give over this information, the private companies, CCA and Geo Group, these billion-dollar companies that make a ton of money off of this, and they don't want to have their secrets out there, essentially, went to court to fight actually ICE from turning over the documents to the public, to the organizations that were fighting for this. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear it, and they essentially had to release information, hugely important information, contracts, about who are these companies holding these, getting contracts for to hold hundreds of thousands of detained immigrants, and what are the conditions in these private facilities? We've seen the conditions in the private facilities. I mean, the publicly run facilities are bad in a lot of ways, but the privately run ones have a much higher rate of abuse that we've seen. We've seen people just to try to get information about what's happening within these. I mean, literally undocumented folks have gone to turn themselves in to end up in these detention facilities and report from within because it's so hard, they're so closed off. So they got these contracts. This was a really key case, but there is still a huge fight to try to get contracts. And now the Health and Human Services is another kind of big target. People are trying to get information about the offices within Health and Human Services that are holding children, a lot of them held by private companies that are providing these facilities. So you have different tools that journalists and researchers are going about trying to get information about, particularly now, detention of children. There are different databases that HHS, the Health and Human Services, has. So, some kind of tips here when you're going to try, before crafting a FOIA request, as has been mentioned before, doing the background research, looking at some of these databases that are available. So for example, I'm sure a lot of folks here are looking at the issue of children at the border and children being detained and where they're being held. Again, you can't ask how many children are being detained, but asking for the data and the records around this policy of detaining children is this kind of pathway to getting information. But first, starting with the databases that are available. So HHS has databases that shows who, it has general information about who's getting the contracts. It is an important place to start. So some reporters have been doing some good stories just based off of this data, information about, just in 2018, almost over 900 million has gone to private facilities holding children in detention. So you can search through that, go through these databases, look who's getting the contracts, pull the data from this. But it only goes so far. So when you're really trying to get to the core of the accountability question, you really need, the contracts. You need who signed the contracts. When there are abuses reported, is the government actually investigating what's happening in the privately run facilities? So you really need to go deeper, and that's where the FOIA work is pretty key. You have to kind of pry those documents out. So that's one case. Another case, yeah, jump in.
So, FOIA allow you to
big loophole. So another one, kind of jumping ahead, FOIA reform is one piece that we're working on. A lot of groups have been working on for a lot of years. to force private contractors, all their records to apply to FOIA because it's a big roadblock. All the documents that they turn over to an agency, when you ask that agency, they need to process those records. But there are these big exemptions, the trade secret exemptions. So if a company can argue, that don't turn that over, that gives away our trade secrets, and we're trying to get these contracts. So that's a huge exemption 4 in FOIA in the federal level. Makes it really hard to get these contracts out. And then information that they just hold, they don't even give to the agency, makes it hard. So their efforts to try to pass legislation to actually make it more concrete that all information that private companies, are holding is subject to FOIA. They need to turn that over immediately, through FOIA processing. It's a challenge. But then you have, so kind of this is also jumping ahead, FOIA tips and looking to the state level, which Michael talked about a bit. State level laws you can actually use and look at, because a lot of these happen at the state level, particularly with private prisons that the Justice Department runs. A lot of those are contracted at the state level, so using state level information laws can help actually get contracts there. Muckrock has gotten a lot of these contracts through this fight. Any other questions on that one? And yeah, feel free, please do jump in. Another really interesting case study last fall, ICE was preparing for reportedly one of the biggest raids in recent history, Operation Mega. And there were a few tips that some advocacy organizations were getting from people on the inside saying this massive raid is coming. We literally don't have the resources to handle it. They are planning to carry out this massive raid to show that we don't have the resources. So when we go to Congress, we can get more money for next year. And these were kind of some of these insiders that were coming out, of ICE and other agencies, saying, you need to generate an advocacy campaign because this is going to be really bad. Part of the advocacy campaign was to file this big joint FOIA request, and then to literally drop the request to ICE facilities all over the country. So it was this kind of generating attention to how secretive this policy was, how problematic the policy was, and getting over 200 people and organizations to sign on to this FOIA request. And so it's part of, this kind of broader advocacy strategy, whereas this is kind of just exemplary of where FOIA kind of can play into this, just one tool in, broader, advocacy campaign around these issues. And then how groups got information from folks on the inside, from people and agencies, to kind of fuel this campaign. This is currently in litigation to actually get this information about this planned raid that was supposed to take place last fall. Through this advocacy campaign, it also helped to stop this raid from happening, or at least to limit it. It wasn't carried out to the extent that it was reportedly planned. To get into kind of some of the state-based requesting that Michael mentioned a little bit, there are a lot of tools at the state level that you can use. So a couple case studies we've been looking at. So ACLU is filing requests and recently got information out of Boston about ICE having access to these certain databases that police are running. Again, a lot of these are privately run, so companies that are providing these services. This one database called CopLink, which integrates police information that ICE has access to, and ICE uses this to go after undocumented folks in the community and target them for detention. And so ACLU got information from the Boston police, filing a request there to understand, how federal agents are working and are sharing information with local police there. Pretty important information that's much more difficult to get out of the hands of federal agencies, I think. Get into some of these tips. Before we get into these, are there any folks that have kind of stories or thoughts about what information you're trying to get and what challenges you've already seen as you're starting to file these FOIA requests?
We can, we filed a FOIA request. The government they dig through and information about how they wanted essentially to update the immigration court and track it for adjudication faster. Trying to get a handle on a lot of these from who's out is on the immigration court recommendation for judicial efficiency. It's really interesting how we're able to obtain the Booz Allen document via FOIA, and what came out of that is that a lot of the issues that advocates have been facing for years, Booz Allen recommended instituting formally. One idea was actually giving judges more procedures to manage their own to create more documentation. So, but one issue we encountered in our focus was we were able to get information, but we continue to see this redactions and over.
Yeah.
And so they keep trying to not really document information contracting with other companies. It's not actually the federal government doing this study, always contract. And so trying to say it's all trade secrets protected. We don't want to expose secret algorithm. And so that's been difficult to get around both the UIRs, the CIS.
Yeah.
Before.
Yeah, before is a bad one. How do we fight exemption 4? How do you fight exemption 4, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's increasing because we're seeing government outsource fundamental parts of the process. I think this is an example where because a lot of times these reports do get passed out a lot, right? It's sort of for agency rather. And so I think trying to see, okay, can you sort of figure out where else was this report involved? Maybe they're going to treat that differently. I think also, that's an area where a lot of times on the initial review, agencies are fairly deferential. Deferential to the private contractor. Sometimes
we did file an appeal at the end of this month.
So sometimes that can release more records. A lot of times what I've found is that like the contractor does, like we had run into a similar issue with Move Fund PC. So a lot of times they that what do you care about? Sometimes going through process notes, say, hey, I want a copy of the process request. I be a little tight. What's being fine? A lot of times the private contractors say, you don't care about this. Say, oh well, I don't want to. So those are some strategies, but it is essentially variety.
And this is one, yeah, where unfortunately litigation might be the end game, I think, in this one. So coordinating early on with the group that's kind of ready to litigate or has litigated before, like Detention Watch Network and CCR. In that case, that was a big one that they were fighting. And so kind of going through and seeing what's already been fought, and that kind of gets in a little bit of the tips of just doing the background research, that really understanding the landscape of what's already been requested out there and things you're looking at. What are some of the lessons learned? Michael gave a lot of great resources. And then when you're kind of crafting the request, going back to a little bit of what Zach said about going after data around, particularly if you're talking to someone in an agency, going after the data around what someone in an agency is telling you. So they're telling you this document exists, this is happening, these really bad atrocities are happening, or even these small abuses are happening, but you know, I really want this to get out there in the public. You know, I think Zach had some really great suggestions about how you craft this around, you know, the data sets that could be available in other detention facilities and thinking about how to request those in other places. And so doing the background research, understanding how the agencies work, looking at internal documents that are available. So, you know, scouring the FOIA reading rooms and then looking at the internal documents that are already available and existing, and looking at the references of other documents within documents that have been declassified. So if you're looking at foreign policy issues, you know, the U.S. Embassy cables always have references to other documents, and then they have 10 other agencies copied to those, you know, that are CC'd on those cables. And so another tactic is targeting several agencies in your FOIA requesting. So looking at agencies, you know, agencies constantly share information and don't even know who they're sharing it with often. So if you have you know, a whistleblower from one agency, look at requesting other agencies where this information may be shared is often a tactic. And then doing the background research to find if a document is referenced in other places, in other reports, footnoted in other places. And then, of course, appealing, as Michael said, that's you have a much higher rate when you're appealing. And then the collaboration kind of aspects that I mentioned. So the philosophy of openness, so Michael mentioned with Document Cloud, putting everything up and sharing gives a lot more just lessons learned and ability to see what's already out there and share what you're doing and then learn from other folks. We've found that is just a really helpful kind of resource generally. And then learning the landscape, as I mentioned, planning litigation strategy early when you're dealing with these really entrenched exemptions like Exemption 4 and trade secrets, thinking about, you know, down the line, this might go to litigation, let's plan early for it. A few of these kind of tips. And then coordinating early with journalists to break stories, obviously. Journalists who are working with sources, and there's a lot of important collaboration there. And yeah, there's a few more that I talked about, but let's, I think, open it up for.
Yeah, let's just we're not gonna have time to do. We had some breakouts on when we did our version on Tuesday, but we'd love to ask, just finish up with questions. Yeah.
Questions for everybody. Have any of you been retaliated against?
I can talk about that if I can hear. I can just
I can hear you.
Yeah, so yeah, the death threats, a lot of painful. Death threats are usually less serious than you, because the odds are most people aren't insane and going to shoot you. They're just going to post up on the internet. What other retaliation? People sometimes freak out at me when I ask them for information. That's always, but it's usually that's more when I'm doing hostile work. And I've been, I think one of the scariest ones was I pissed off, this is actually not related to Gap, this was before I was working for Gap, but there was some, right before Trump was inaugurated, it came out, he'd secretly been meeting with a bunch of millionaire kind of kooky anti-vaccine people. And I was calling them to confirm they had met with Trump, and one of them threatened basically to sue me and make my life miserable and pay all my money. Anyway, he didn't sue me, and they didn't like being called anti-vaccine publicly, even though they were. So that's actually the thing that scared me the most, and scares as someone who's in this world. The thing that I'm terrified of is I piss off some Peter Thiel or someone who's just going to spend $1 billion or $10 million making my life miserable legally until I just run out and give up. And that's something to be aware of. The source protection too is like that in many ways is as scary as the government going after your sources, is some rich billionaire filing a slap suit against you to try and drain you of money and then get your sources that way by just filing motion. It's that scary. That actually, if you want to name my nightmare, that's my nightmare. Anyways, that's things I've dealt with. You guys, any retaliation?
My phone was tapped when I was representing a whack and hunt whistleblower during that period. They were very public about, they were very I felt like the effort was so obvious. And I remember we were doing the trial, we were being followed and things in the hotel room.
shifted around. I mean, it sounds crazy, but like I know it sounds crazy, but it was so obvious. It was definitely intended to intimidate. And actually, I think that was a good example of where being very public as a whistleblower and the disclosure is super important. Gives you more protection. That was pretty creepy. Actually, that was like working at a nuclear facility at Rocky Flats. Team. I think you guys should be worried, but it's really the sources that are the ones that are vulnerable to reprisal. I mean, certainly journalists are. I mean, we've seen them being threatened with thrown in jail and their records, so that's, and, public interest organizations can, the slap suit issue and being subpoenaed and all those issues are really real. And that can, bankrupt, I mean, Greenpeace is fighting slap suits and you can bankrupt them, not bankrupt, but it's very expensive. Hugely distracting. I mean, not what you want to be spending your time on as an organization. So, but it's really the people who are suffering reprisal, the people who are reporting the information. Again, why the journalists are definitely at risk, but certainly the sources, and they just don't have the resources, even emotionally, sometimes psychologically, to deal with that. It can be really, really challenging. The harassment. Just kind of the subtle things, not just losing your job. It's just, not being threatened at work, being isolated, being ignored by your peers, having to kind of be the walking dead, walking around the halls as a whistleblower that no one wants to deal with. It can be it's really hard. So,
question?
Yeah, other question.
Yeah. You had mentioned. What I've noticed, so where I work, we tend to get a lot of documents sent to us from any official, like our organization. As you know where it came from, and whether or not to post documents. But it's something where a lot of times we err on the side of listening, as long as there's no identifying part or in order to help other attorneys want to share information, sitting on things and building back. But are there, tips or recommendations we all have if we are obtaining documents from other attorneys that actually have this on the ground or what we should be doing?
Yeah, I'm sure y'all, this came up on Tuesday, actually. What happens when you get the brown envelope with, documents and that clearly are given to you because they want you to use them, right? They want them out. At the same time, the fact that they're in a brown envelope with no identifying marks is a tell that they're interested in not being named as a source or being revealed as a source. And so, what can you do to harness that information and honor, obviously, the intent of the disclosure of giving you that information without obviously breaching the trust that they're giving to you implicitly by doing it anonymously. So, I think that one thing that, we, obviously not putting identifying marks up if you're posting it online, that's important. One thing that, I think Jim Risen was here on Tuesday, and we didn't really get into this, but we did a little bit with the reality winner situation when reporters are giving copies of the actual document that they're given to trusted sources inside. One thing to know is, there's an insider threat program in the government where basically you're kind of compelled to, report, if you know about potential leaks, kind of have it theoretically a duty to report that. So even if you have a trusted source to verify the document or the information in the government, you're essentially putting them in a really conflicted position of being loyal to you versus being loyal to to a rule they could get in trouble with not following. So, not giving them the original document to verify whether or not this is true or who it might be from is important. I mean, Jim gave the tip of how actually important it is to try to figure out who the source of the document is so you can try to protect them because so you don't inadvertently hurt them. And so that's the hard, there's always these inadvertent, not wanting to inadvertently out your source or make them vulnerable, and tips, there are actually tips to do that. So maybe.
I'd say also, if it's online, figure out if it has metadata and then wipe it. That's sort of basic.
And I think of kind of building the research around it. So when you're posting something, it's not kind of in a vacuum. And again, kind of doing the research to see what other related documents are out there. So you can, also post documents that are related to kind of help, corroborate what's there, and then working with other organizations. It takes time, but then of course filing FOIA requests about those documents too. It is another way with that slower process. But kind of building the research around it, I think, can be helpful when you post those.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of news organizations start recreating documents that have been leaked just to get around. We actually, through Document Cloud, we've been working on some experimental software to look for and highlight microdots and that sort of stuff. But the reality is that there's so many things that go on. I think one thing about source protection is once you get to the part that you're starting to worry about security and source protection, it's too late. Really, the stuff you've done for years can come back to bite you in all sorts of ways. And so I think if you're sort of very worried about security, I think it's very easy for mistakes that have been made years before to come back and haunt people when it comes to this stuff. So erring on the side of caution, erring on the side of sort of recreating documents, only using the exact snippets need to be posted publicly, because these things can come back to haunt. And then also going on the litigation, I think one thing earlier talking about retaliation is a lot of times we think sort of like if the government comes after us, we've been sued a number of times, and it sort of made us think through like, okay, our documents are hosted on Amazon, we rely on Google for our email. People can kind of then route around that. Particularly in civil litigation is something that I think people kind of underestimate as a threat, and sort of like thinking through sort of how do you want to maintain this, and making sure you're deleting stuff when you're done with it, or only keeping offline copies is something that I've started. I think Jim Risen, a lot of times people have been saying, oh, physical sources, physical handoffs are still the best for a lot of stuff. That can be true with that sort of thing. Once you've digitized it and put it on Google servers or anything else, it can last forever and ever.
Yeah. Also, one more thing on source protection. This is something actually I've kind of wondered about. So be careful with usernames, even if the source thinks they're anonymous. So my favorite tool on earth, I've told the interns about this, is something called PIPL, People, which is basically a social media search engine. And you would be surprised at, like, I have one source, and he's not in a very compromising position, which is why I kind of thought this is okay, and it's already too late because it's already indexed. And I didn't want to make him more stressed out because it wouldn't make any difference. But I just checked his username one day. I was like, oh shit, it has his real name associated with his username that he's been saying all sorts of things online, and now it's forever associated. Like, he's not gonna be able to wipe that. And you know what? I think it's low stakes. No one's looking for his personal political opinions, but it's not great. And the thing is, people aren't aware that, especially if they make the mistake of using these same accounts over years. Like, we actually, and I'm not going to give a specific instance, Dana will know this one because Dana was not thrilled when this thing happened, but ended up with the husband of a senior official in the government harassing me on Twitter. And it took me all of 20 minutes to figure out who he was from what he thought was an anonymous account. And we didn't really do anything with it, but we're like, oh, so this is now this guy's burner account. And it took me matching up. I found his Google profile, found pictures of him with kids, and then matched up with his Facebook. I was like, yep, this is who I think it was. Again, we kind of guessed. But it's people are not as anonymous as they think. So if you're communicating with XYZ Tiger, go check that on People, see what comes up. And A, it's going to find your source and know who they are so you can protect them. But B, again, people are really leave a trail on the internet that's really easy to track if you're happy tracking it. And it's not always that great. So they should be aware of that. And it really
All right, I don't want to keep you guys any longer. We've been here for 2 hours. Thank you so much. Please do come up to us if you have specific questions. I wish we'd had more time for breakouts. I'm sorry we didn't. We just had a lot of information, obviously, to share with you. Thanks for participating during it. If you are interested in either supporting expanded whistleblower protection legislation, which we would really love you to add your organization's name to that, or if you're interested in supporting the recent whistleblower doctors revealing information about detention centers and harm to children, I'd love your card or your information so I can contact you later as we step up stakeholder engagement. So thanks so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And thanks to the panel for sharing their time.